Following a completely forgettable fill-in issue, Mark Millar took over Swamp Thing with issue 140. He would write the series until it was cancelled with issue 171. Actually, the opening story arc was co-written with Grant Morrison, but Millar would allegedly work solo for the remainder of the series. Although, according to Morrison, they assisted or ghost-wrote a fair amount of Millar's material until the early 2000s. Now, I am in the position to admit that Mark Millar's work doesn't appeal to me whatsoever. Therefore, my objectivity during this segment is questionable. My bias now established, let's move on. During this run of Swamp Thing, one can track Millar's progress from a writer establishing himself into the successful writer he is today. His edgy writing tendencies begin toned down, but they fully bloom later in the series. Millar's entire run on the series was dedicated to getting Swamp Thing to a point where he no longer had any humanity. This would, in turn, cause him to destroy all life on the planet. Along the way, he meets with, and is granted power by, the parliaments of stones, waves, vapors, and flames. With all this power at his command, he is granted access to the Parliament of Worlds. With this ultimate power unlocked, Swamp Thing suddenly decides not to destroy the Earth after all. In all fairness, one has to make allowances for the somewhat abrupt epiphany at the end due to the fact that the title had been cancelled. Millar might not have had the time to do anything but a quick reset. On paper, this is a decent plot with some interesting potential to explore. Instead, it's a deeply flawed piece of work that lacks any sense of logic if one spends any time thinking about it. Admittedly, Millar does make the same presumption many prior writers made when approaching the concept, namely that the parliaments of the Earth desire to wipe out humanity. Alan Moore had established a reasonable explanation why this hadn't and wouldn't occur. While humanity is doing a good job at destroying the environment, it's also a necessary presence on the planet. Basically, humanity is an essential part of the ecosystem. More to the point, the Swamp Thing was there to keep humanity in check and to prevent them from getting to the point where extermination was necessary. He is an ambassador, not a weapon. Naturally, it's more interesting to the audience if Swamp Thing is a weapon. That's basic narrative conflict. So it's understandable why a writer would choose that path over the other. Also, environmentalism was a huge talking point in the 90s. So, having Swamp Thing, an Earth elemental, be the avatar of vengeance played into the general bias that nature itself was angry at humanity. Instead of picking apart Millar's entire run, let's settle on a few examples of the flaws. In the second arc, River Run, Swamp Thing encounters a dead woman who needs him to enter the short stories she has written and then bring them all to a satisfying conclusion. It's an interesting conceptual premise. However, Millar completely skips over how Swamp Thing makes himself fictional and then inserts himself as an active element in a story that's already been written. There is the vague suggestion that these stories occur on alternate worlds, but that still doesn't explain how Swamp Thing crosses from one universe to another. It happens simply because Millar needs it to happen. As another brief example of this same flaw, there is a shadowy group of men that are allegedly manipulating Swamp Thing into being a destroyer of worlds. But Millar never illustrates these men doing anything other than have them say that's exactly what they're doing. This flaw is prevalent in the series and in much of Millar's work. He doesn't show, he tells. I'm going to stop at 2 examples. As stated earlier, I am predisposed to see these flaws, so there's no critical value in continuing. Sales of the series were once again in decline during Millar's tenure on the title. However, this was likely due to the comic book market imploding rather than the quality of the stories he wrote. So, in late 1996, after 171 consecutive issues, the Swamp Thing series was cancelled once again. Despite announcing in the letter column that there were plans for Swamp Thing following the end of the series, the character would actually lay dormant until 2004. Swamp Thing did make cameo appearances at the funerals for Hal Jordan and Jim Corrigan, and he guest starred in Aquaman and Hellblazer, but that was about it. It's worth mentioning these appearances because all of the changes Millar had made to the character were completely ignored. Swamp Thing was a representative of the Green, not the champion of all the various parliaments of the Earth. It wouldn't be until the 2004 series that these changes would be addressed. In the year 2000, the Swamp Thing series was resurrected again. Sort of. This time it focused entirely on the adventures of Swamp Thing and Abby Holland's daughter, Tefe. In other words, using the Swamp Thing name for the series was an obvious attempt to attract an audience familiar with the character. even though it had almost nothing to do with Swamp Thing. The series would only last 20 issues. Notably, it was entirely written by Brian K. Vaughn, a writer who would go on to write more successful titles like Why the Last Man, Runaways, and more recently, Saga. For the most part, this is rather forgettable material. It's not terrible, but it certainly isn't up to the standard Vaughn would be known for later in his career. If one is familiar with his work, and they were given an early issue without the credits page, one would likely not say it was Brian K. Vaughn's work. It really is that different. The series follows Tefe Holland as she wanders the continent trying to find a purpose. It explores her ability to control both plants and flesh, and what it's like to be a teen girl with immense power and responsibility, but having no guidelines concerning what to do with that power. So, Tefe wanders, and honestly, gets very little insight into herself or how the world works. The series does acknowledge and incorporate Tefe's past, such as being given to the Parliament of Trees as a child. It doesn't get too caught up on prior continuity, though. When the Swamp Thing shows up near the end of the series, he has given up the power previously given to him, and now he only works for the Green. This development will be completely ignored in the next ongoing series. Andy Diggle, who had previously rebooted The Losers for Vertigo, stepped in for a 6-issue arc to do the same for Swamp Thing. Putting aside the prior Tefe Holland title, it had been 8 years since the last solo Swamp Thing series. This 6-issue introductory arc was an attempt to clear the stage and to undo all the changes that had been done to Swamp Thing over the years. The character was overpowered and inhuman, and as such, wasn't relatable to the mere mortals reading the comic. Diggle acknowledged and incorporated everything Mark Millar had established and basically ignored the Tefe Holland solo series. The basic premise is, Swamp Thing needs the humanity of Alec Holland restored. This restoration will balance the character out, depower him, and in essence, turn him into the muck-encrusted monstrosity everyone knows. Swamp Thing's focus is on his daughter, Tefe, who contains the final power he needs to become the supreme and only power on the planet. Once he acquires this power, he will destroy all life. This echoes the conclusion of the Mark Millar run, but it ignores the fact that this plot point had already been addressed. The story, as well written as it may be, doesn't make any logical sense. As established by Alan Moore, Alec Holland was never the Swamp Thing. He was a plant that had the consciousness of Alec Holland imprinted on it. Holland was the template, so to speak, but Swamp Thing was a unique personality that had, for a brief time, believed it was a human being trapped inside a plant body. The actual Alec Holland died, ended up in the afterlife, and hung out there until he was necessary for the plot. Holland wasn't an actual participant in any of the Swamp Thing's adventures. However, the Alec Holland that is put into Swamp Thing has knowledge of the creature's past and believes he was once this creature. And this Alec Holland states that Tefe is his actual daughter. None of this is true or possible. In fact, it contradicts everything previously established by Alan Moore and all the writers that followed him. Yes, this is being a nitpicky continuity nerd. But this reboot is utilizing continuity for its own purposes, so major contradictions do stand out. With that said, it is a well-written reboot. Diggle does set up a reasonable series of events that lead to a mostly satisfying conclusion, if one can overlook the major logical flaw. These 6 issues do what needed to be done, namely to erase all the changes done to Swamp Thing and to allow the character an opportunity for more stories. To that degree, it is quite successful. Joshua Dysart took over the Swamp Thing series following Andy Diggle's reboot, and he would write it until the series concluded with the 29th issue. These are reasonably competent horror stories that are greatly enhanced by the artwork. Unfortunately, not a lot happens that is memorable. Dysart spends the entirety of his run exploring what's called the Holland Mind. This is the essence of Alec Holland that, allegedly, tempers Swamp Thing. There is also an examination of both Alec and Linda Holland in the years prior to the accident that created Swamp Thing. For the most part, Dysart does a good job incorporating the Cajun elements from the Nancy A. Collins run and the horror-based themes from the Alan Moore run. At the same time, he spends a significant amount of time exploring Alec Holland's past through flashbacks. In the end, though, there's just something missing, and it's something that's not easily defined. Admittedly, there are a reasonable amount of good elements, and the artwork is perfectly suited to the material, but it's boring, to be honest. Perhaps this portion of the series is indicative of the hole the character had found himself in for many years. Everyone that followed Alan Moore wanted to add something new and better to the concept first, then find stories to tell with that new and improved concept. All of these additions made the character overly convoluted. The overall flaw is putting too much emphasis on the mythology. Too much time was spent defining the characteristics of the character rather than providing challenges that would reveal the characteristics in an organic manner. Over time, what writers had left to define became very granular and not very interesting to explore. Following the conclusion of this series, this version of Swamp Thing would be retired for all intents and purposes. As an imprint, Vertigo was struggling. This resulted in prior DC characters, such as Animal Man, John Constantine, and Swamp Thing, being reclaimed and added to the mainstream DC continuity once again. So, the era that began when Alan Moore changed the character forever came to a close. Hello and thanks for watching. Well, that's it. I finally made it to the end of the series. We've explored Swamp Thing's glory days and its slow decline until it was reintegrated into the mainstream DC universe. It's a very messy transition, where I think Swamp Thing was reintroduced 2 or 3 times in the space of a year, but that's a topic for another time. Now, I realize there's probably a lot of people who rather enjoyed Mark Millar's run and might think I did him dirty. Honestly, I think I was pretty fair. And if you disagree, well, fair enough. As always, like what you like. Don't think I'm trying to make you change your opinion to reflect my own. Sincerely, read it and enjoy it. I mean, Millar is hugely popular, and I can see what might be appealing, but what he does just doesn't work for me. It's one of those things, you know? Don't you have a writer or artist that everyone likes, but their work just turns you off? Let me know in the comments below. Thanks to all the fine members that directly support this channel. And if you've made it this far in the video, why not subscribe or become a member? I try not to be an annoying pitchman like Funky Flashman or something, but this channel needs support. A lot of support. So if you like what you see, then click a few links below this video and help out. Every subscription, membership, or donation is greatly appreciated. Not to mention, it makes the mythical YouTube algorithm notice this channel, which for some reason it seems to avoid recommending. Okay, that's enough from me. I made my pitch. Thank you for watching. I'll talk at you later. Until next time.